faint-hearted. But perhaps the most influential voice at this time was that of Martin Buber, arguably one of the most important Jewish thinkers of the 20th century. Buber argued Buber rejected the national political Zionism of Herzl and Jabotinsky for a Zionism based on a moral and the spiritual values of Judaism. He was also an advocate of dialogue with the Arabic people, without which he considered that Zionism would fail. And I quote him, "We have not settled Palestine together with the Arabs, but alongside them. Settlement alongside, when two nations inhabit the same country, which fails to become settlement together with, must necessarily become a state against. This is bound to happen here, but despite the obstacles in our path, the way is still open for reaching a settlement together with. If we do not attain such a relationship with the Arabs of Palestine, we will never realize the aims of Zionism." Sadly, these were not the voices that prevailed, and what they predicted has come to pass. Now, for a very brief look at the current situation. The status quo, as we all know, is incessant mimetic violence, which varies in intensity from isolated attacks by Palestinians, retaliation by the Israeli Defense Forces, to full-scale wars we saw recently in Lebanon. The wall that has been built has reduced the number of suicide bombings, but rockets continue to rain down on some Israeli towns from Palestinian territory and from the south of Lebanon. Israel has withdrawn its settlers from the Gaza Strip, but still virtually controls the area with a blockade, and continues to expand the settlements on the West Bank and East Jerusalem on Palestinian land. The Palestinians respond with more rage and more violence. The IDF retaliates. The situation, I do not need to tell you, is a major recruiting sergeant for Islamic extremism. There is, of course, the two-state solution, one version of which is that Israel pulls back behind the Green Line before the 67 occupations, which nobody believes is going to happen. Then there is the two-state solution based on the facts on the ground, that is the ever-expanding Israeli settlements on Palestinian land. What is on the table for Palestine in negotiations is 9% of the 22% of Palestine that remained after the 67 war. It consists of 4 isolated areas of land which are joined by roads to which only Israelis have access. So nobody actually believes in this proposition. Finally, there is the one-state solution, one democratic, secular, bi-national state, which in the light of the current situation may seem utopian, but it is very much in keeping with the non-sacrificial stream of Zionism expressed by the voices of Buber, Epstein and Hahn that we spoke of earlier. This idea has very little traction with most of Israelis at the moment, but it is being mooted by a number of Israel's influential intellectuals and its artists, as well as many right across the spectrum of Israeli society as the situation becomes more and more desperate and intractable. Now perhaps I'd like to give you a brief overview of current thinking on both sides of this divide, which I recently heard speaking to Israelis and Palestinians. First, let's look at the Israelis. There is, at the moment, an atmosphere of pessimism and anxiety about the future of Israel with most of the people I spoke to. Many of the best and brightest are leaving. In fact, more people are leaving Israel than are arriving. Some of these are leaving for economic reasons. But as one of my Israeli friends explained to me, there is also an internal Jewish dynamic at play here. As many are coming to the conclusion that this is not where Judaism is lived well. Jewish people live better in the US or in Europe or in other parts of the world. From a religious perspective, the United States, for example, provides a much more diverse and pluralistic society, especially for those of the Reformed tradition. There is fear of the democratic time bomb, demographic, I beg your pardon, demos as in people, time bomb which is presented by the Arab people within Israel. A fear that is exacerbated by the continual expansion of Israel, which continually brings more and more of the Arabic peoples into the greater Israel, and they are not leaving. There is among certain Israelis the thinking that it is possible and perhaps inevitable to live with this constant level of violence. However, huge questions are being raised in certain circles. These questions are, does Judaism need a physical state? can a Jewish state be democratic? Is the Zionist project viable in the light of current realities? And what is the nature of Jewish identity? Palestinians, of course, had very different things to say. I was told that the majority of Palestinians do not want and do not like Hamas, but they will vote for it for the simple reason that it is the only entity making any real effort to protect their interests. Fatah is seen as corrupt and its leadership as weak and ineffectual. As regards Israeli expansion, there is rage, but there is also resistance. I spoke to one of my friends, Palestinian friends, asking how the Palestinians felt about this constant building on their land. And I'm going to quote what she said to me, which is fairly chilling, but this is how she put it to me. They want us to leave, but we're not going to leave. They're making life as possible as they can for us to make us leave, but we're not going to leave. They can't bus us out, and they can't do 1948 again. So why don't they face reality and talk of a binational state, as in some years' time there would be much more of us than there are of them in any event? Those were the opinions I heard. Now, it is not my intention here to proffer a solution to this tragic situation, nor that would be presumptuous in the extreme, nor to express my own opinions. But what I want to indicate is that there are very important voices in Israel and in the wider Jewish community and in the Palestinian community that in the context of these sessions we have not yet heard. There is the new wave, for example, just looking at the Israelis, there is the new wave of young Israeli historians, such as Avi Shlam in St. Anthony's College, Oxford, or Ilan Pape in Haifa. Writing recently in the British press, Avi Shlam commented, "It would not be madness for Israel to acknowledge the injustices to Palestinians of the past and the present, and to begin to attempt to redress them. It is in fact the only way forward." Ilan Pape is one of the most prominent advocates of the one-state, binational state. He is Associate Professor of Middle East History at Haifa University. There's Tom Segev, a historian and prominent journalist for Haaretz, who wrote a remarkable book called One Palestine Complete, which is a very honest appraisal of the 100 years that we're talking about. There's Gideon Levy, another very well-known journalist, who writing just 10 days ago, I read in Haaretz, this very good Israeli newspaper, Gideon Levy wrote the following: "The Nakba," which of course is the Arabic word for the disaster, the catastrophe, which the Palestinian people used to refer to 1948 and thereafter. "The Nakba will not be erased from the memory of its victims. Only when Israel remembers the Nakba will peace reign." There's Amira Haas, the daughter of Holocaust survivors, another prominent journalist and one of these voices. And there is, of course, Jacqueline Rose of London University. I'd like to finish perhaps with a quote from Daniel Barenboim about the Israeli point of view. Barenboim said, and I think this was in the New York Times quite recently, "It is all too easily forgotten that there was a moderate Zionism. There were people like Martin Buber who said from the beginning that the right of a Jewish state must be made acceptable to the existing population, the non-Jews. Militant Zionism, on the other hand, did not develop further in its thinking. Even today, it is based on a lie that the land that the Jews settled was empty." As yet, we have not heard a Palestinian voice in these sessions, and many of us could be forgiven for thinking that all Palestinians are bomb-throwing primitive Islamic extremists, when nothing could be further from the truth. Let me name a few names that we could eventually hear. One is Ahmed Sami Khalidi, also from St. Anthony's College, Oxford, who recently wrote, "At the one end of the spectrum of possibilities is an open-ended and continual spiral of violence. At the other end is a new set of relations between Arab and Jew, and new forms of association in the land of Palestine that go beyond the dying paradigm of a two-state solution towards different formulae of power sharing, partition and sovereignty." There is also Dr. Noor Masala, another voice we could hear, a political scientist in Britain. There's Said Nimia, a British-trained political scientist at Riverside University on the West Bank. And of course there is the Christian dimension. We could hear Michel Saba, the former Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, a Christian voice, the Catholic Archbishop of Jerusalem. There's Jamal Khadr, the head of religious studies at Bethlehem University, another Christian voice. We sometimes tend to forget that there is a Christian dimension to this struggle.